Hello. So, Channel 4 has just shown archive footage of Nelson Mandela praising Fidel Castro and visiting him. The two were pretty close. I made the previous video about the differences between Castro and Mandela, and everything I said in that video stands because Mandela, I believe, did hold true to democratic principles in South Africa. In South Africa. Um, but there is a side to Mandela that people ignore. And the problem with marbleizing anyone, is that when you put them on this pedestal where they are so admired and so respected that they're above critique, then anyone who voices a different point of view is branded in a certain way. So, for instance, anyone who's criticizing Castro is going to be dismissed as a neocon or um, people just rush to judgment without trying to be objective on these things. And one thing I detest is personality cults of anyone, any human being. Now, I still think Nelson Mandela was a great man. I think it is quite a remarkable thing to be in jail for 27 years, to come out within a few years of coming out of jail, much of it solitary confinement, becoming a leader of a significant country, to become a world leader and to use that to genuinely try and seek reconciliation and democracy. So I think Mandela's approach in South Africa really is admirable. I do stand by that. I think he, in that sense, was an incredible man. Mandela also had a certain way of communicating, a certain, how can I put it, when he spoke, he sounded wise, he sounded like an authority figure. Mandela was a remarkable man, but he was not a perfect man, and one of his biggest flaws, in my opinion, was his hypocrisy when it came to totalitarian regimes abroad. Now, Cuba is a good example. When you think of it this way, Nelson Mandela fought his life to get rid of a wicked, unjust system, apartheid. Now, it's well documented that apartheid was a brutal system. No need to go through all the history on that. And Mandela done that for the freedom of black South Africans and to bring about genuine democracy in his country. But then he went and defended dictators in other parts of the world. Why? Because they shared his early. I mean, what shouldn't be forgotten is Nelson Mandela was sympathetic to communism in his early days. I don't know if he joined the South African Communist Party as such, but he was certainly sympathetic to communist movements at that time. Also, let's remember Nelson Mandela was not a pacifist, another fact that needs to be remembered. Um, that's a fact. And he looked at the likes of Castro as brothers in arms because Castro was so anti-American, and probably Mandela. In fact, that's why I suspect Mandela turned a blind eye to the excesses of Robert Mugabe. I remember when Mugabe was jailing opposition and so on, there was some pressure on Mandela to openly condemn it, and he was silent for a very long time. And I wonder, was that because he felt it would be too awkward to criticise a fellow Pan-Africanist revolutionary in that sense? So to me, that is Mandela's biggest failing, the fact that he was inconsistent when it came to human rights and liberty in South Africa, to which he was a respected and admirable figure, versus his advocacy of totalitarian regimes abroad. And the problem is anyone who says that is dismissed as a right winger, or you ignore apartheid or whatever. I think it's compatible to admire someone whilst also recognising their shortcomings, and I think that is one of Mandela's biggest shortcomings. He could have really used his authority, I think, to speak out and say, well, okay, I agree with Castro's views on America, but that doesn't justify what he does in Cuba. And that's the problem I have with Mandela's approach, because these sort of old archive videos come up and people come out with these sweeping nonsense statements like, these are two great leaders, we'll never see the like of them again. Mandela was a great leader. Castro was successful in terms of calming people, in terms of presenting himself as the poster boy of cool Marxism. Every lefty student around the world has posters of Che Guevara. I've no doubt had Che lived, the two men would have had some sort of power struggle. Che could well have ended up being a dictator. As it turned out, he was like the James Dean to, I don't know, Fidel Castro's Marlon Brando. So that is one aspect of Mandela I don't have much respect for, because I think it is hypocritical. It's simply hypocritical to preach equality, human rights, and human progress whilst turning a blind eye to dictatorships. And whilst I'm on the subject, I'll just touch on this briefly. It is also one of the most hypocritical strains of Pan-Africanist ideology. What's basically, if we look at modern history, if you look between roughly the 1950s and 1970s, there was all these independence movements in Africa to shake off the old empires, especially Britain and France. Now, and Portugal was another big one. Now, when that happened, it was in many ways justifiably seen as a morally righteous movement, because they were looking for self-determination and not to be exploited and all the rest of it. And, the moral wrongs of imperialism are very well documented. But the problem was, many of those initial freedom fighters, the likes of Robert Mugabe, instead of going down the route of being genuine democrats for their people, they ended up as despots. And the problem I have with Pan-Africanist ideology is it completely ignores the crimes of African dictators. So that's just hypocritical. You cannot, on one hand, preach about the terrible Europeans exploiting Africans when you have dictators doing exactly the same thing. The only reason they're not criticised as much is because of that kind of cultural image that they have. Now, to be fair to Mandela, he did try to rein in some of the extremes of the ANC. He publicly renounced Winnie Mandela for her connections with street thuggery and so on. So I do think Mandela done a hell of a lot more than any other post-colonial leader. And I think Mandela is a great man. But his biggest mistake, like I say, was this lack of consistency. And, if you go to a video about Mandela and you say that, you'll get loads of thumbs down and everyone will say you're ignorant, blah, blah, blah. But they don't actually consider this point. They don't consider the fact that it is inconsistent. And I think it's a good example of someone allowing their ideology to bring about a sort of fraternal empathy, and it kind of puts on blinders. So I think Mandela deliberately ignored the human rights abuses in Cuba. I'm sure he knew full well what was going on, but he ignored them because, hey, Castro was a comrade. And I just wish people would be more open-minded about this. It's the same with every marbleized figure, the same with Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was a womanizer. He treated opponents like shit. He definitely crossed the line at times. He was a hypocrite, because whilst he preached about Muslim values, like I say, he was a womanizing around. And he held fringe racist views. So, people need to stop marbleizing individuals and treating them like they're above reproach. Everyone has faults. Look at Aung San Suu Kyi today. Again, someone I do admire, but she has been notably silent on the issue of the plight of the Rohingyas in Burma. She should be a lot more outspoken on that. So look, we need to remember no one is perfect, and it's okay to admire someone, but let's just not assume that because they're an admired person, they're somehow above reproach. And I think Mandela was wrong about that. It was hypocritical. Full stop. If you thumb down this video, I don't care. But everything I've said is a verifiable fact.